3 years ago, my world crumbled with a single sentence that echoed through the lecture hall like a death sentence. Professor Margaret Chen's voice cut through the silence with surgical precision as she looked directly at me and declared, "Women simply lack the cognitive architecture for advanced mathematics. It's not personal, Miss Rodriguez, it's biology." The snickers from my male classmates felt like acid on my skin, but it was the satisfied nod from the department head in the back row that truly broke something inside me. That moment didn't destroy me, though. It transformed me into something far more dangerous than Professor Chen could have ever imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is my story of academic humiliation, relentless determination, and a comeback so profound it would rewrite the very foundations of mathematical theory. Stay with me, because what happened next will challenge everything you think you know about genius, gender, and the price of underestimating the wrong person. I was 22 when Professor Chen's words branded themselves into my memory. My name is Elena Rodriguez, and I had always been the girl who saw patterns where others saw chaos. Numbers weren't just symbols to me, they were a language more beautiful and precise than any poetry ever written. Growing up in a small apartment above my grandmother's bakery in Queens, I would calculate the perfect ratios for her recipes while other kids played outside. The smell of fresh bread and the scratch of pencil on paper became the twin soundtracks of my childhood. Mathematics had been my sanctuary since I could hold a crayon. While my 3 younger brothers ran through the cramped apartment like tiny hurricanes, I found peace in the corner by the window, working through problems that would make high school seniors sweat. My mother, Isabella, worked double shifts at the hospital as a nursing assistant, and my father had disappeared when I was 8, leaving behind only a collection of unpaid bills and broken promises. But numbers never lied to me. They never abandoned me. They were constant, reliable, and infinitely forgiving of my mistakes as long as I was willing to learn from them. By the time I reached high school, I was already taking calculus classes at the local community college. My guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, was a soft-spoken woman who wore cardigans in every color of the rainbow. She would stay after school to help me navigate college applications, making photocopies on the ancient machine that jammed every third page. When I told her I wanted to major in mathematics, she paused, choosing her words carefully. "Elena, you're brilliant, there's no question about that. But have you considered education? You could teach mathematics, inspire the next generation." Her suggestion felt like a gentle redirect, a polite way of saying that someone like me, a first-generation college student from Queens with calloused hands from helping at the bakery, should probably aim for something more practical, more attainable. But I had already fallen in love with pure mathematics. Not the practical applications that everyone always asked about, but the abstract beauty of theorem and proof, the elegant dance of logic that could unlock truths about the universe itself. I wanted to push the boundaries of human knowledge, to discover something that had never been seen before. The scholarship to Columbia University felt like validation from the universe itself. My first 2 years at Columbia were a revelation. The campus buzzed with intellectual energy that made my skin tingle. Gothic buildings housed centuries of accumulated wisdom, and I walked those halls with the reverence of someone entering a cathedral. Professor Williams, who taught my introduction to real analysis, was encouraging in a way that made me believe I belonged there. He would nod approvingly when I raised my hand, and once after class, he mentioned that my proof technique showed unusual creativity. I studied with an intensity that worried my roommate Jessica, a pre-med student from Connecticut, who kept normal human hours. While she maintained a social life complete with sorority mixers and weekend trips to her family's house in the Hamptons, I lived in the mathematics library. The building stayed open 24 hours, and I knew every corner, every quiet study nook, every vending machine that occasionally gave free snacks when you hit it at exactly the right angle. My junior year changed everything. Advanced abstract algebra, with Professor Margaret Chen, was supposed to be the crown jewel of the undergraduate mathematics program. Chen had graduated from MIT, completed her doctorate at Princeton, and published papers that redefined entire subfields. She was the first woman to earn tenure in Columbia's mathematics department, a fact that initially made me proud. Here was proof that someone like me could make it to the very top of this male-dominated field. Professor Chen was 43, with salt and pepper hair she kept in a severe bun and wire-rimmed glasses that seemed to magnify her perpetually disapproving expression. She wore the same style of charcoal blazer every day, as if she had ordered a dozen identical copies to eliminate any decision-making from her morning routine. Her office was sparse, containing only essential furniture and shelves lined with mathematical journals arranged with military precision. The class itself was small, just 12 students, and I was one of only 2 women. The other was Amanda Fitzgerald, whose father was a mathematics professor at Yale, and whose pedigree included generations of academics. Amanda spoke with casual confidence about concepts that made my head spin, referencing papers and theorems as if they were old family friends. She had grown up in a world where intellectual discourse happened over dinner, where mathematical insight was expected rather than celebrated. From the first day, Professor Chen's teaching style was brutal. She would call on students randomly, dissecting their responses with surgical precision. Wrong answers were met with sighs of exasperation. Hesitation was treated as evidence of insufficient preparation. The atmosphere in that classroom was thick with anxiety, every student afraid of becoming the next target of her academic scalpel. I threw myself into the coursework with desperate determination. Group theory, ring theory, field extensions, Galois theory, concepts that had seemed abstract and beautiful in my textbooks became weapons of intellectual warfare in Chen's classroom. I would arrive 30 minutes early to review my notes one final time, and I stayed late to work through problem sets that seemed designed to break spirits rather than build understanding. The first exam was a disaster. Not just for me, but for most of the class. The average score was 47%. Chen posted the results outside her office without names, just student ID numbers and grades. When I found my score, 34%, I felt physically sick. This was the first mathematics test I had ever failed in my entire life. I sought help immediately. Chen held office hours twice a week, and I became a regular fixture in the uncomfortable chair across from her desk. She would listen to my questions with the patience of someone waiting for a particularly slow child to finish speaking, then explain the concepts in the same rapid-fire manner she used in lectures. When I asked for alternative approaches or additional practice problems, she would suggest that perhaps I should reconsider whether I was truly prepared for graduate-level mathematics. The second exam was marginally better, 41%, but still a failing grade. By this point, several students had already dropped the class. The ones who remained formed study groups that somehow never included me. I wasn't sure if it was intentional exclusion or if they simply assumed I wouldn't be able to contribute anything valuable. I started meeting with Dr. Peterson, a graduate student who served as the teaching assistant. He was kind and patient, explaining concepts in ways that Chen never bothered to. During one of our sessions, he mentioned that he had struggled with Chen's teaching style when he took her class as an undergraduate. "She's brilliant, don't get me wrong," he said, adjusting his glasses nervously. "But she doesn't seem to understand that not everyone processes information the same way she does. Some of the best mathematicians I know had trouble in her classes." His words were meant to be comforting, but they raised a troubling question. If Chen's teaching style was problematic for multiple students, why was nothing being done about it? Peterson's expression, when I asked, suggested that this was not a new conversation, and not one that had ever led to meaningful change. The breaking point came during the third exam review session. I had been working on a particularly complex problem involving field automorphisms for over an hour, making steady progress through the logical steps. When I finally raised my hand to share my approach, Chen listened with her usual expression of barely contained impatience. "That's incorrect, Miss Rodriguez," she said before I had even finished explaining my reasoning. "You're making a fundamental error in your understanding of the underlying structure." I tried to explain where I was coming from, showing my work step by step, but she cut me off with a wave of her hand. "This is exactly what I mean about insufficient preparation. You're attempting to apply techniques without understanding the theoretical foundation." The room fell silent. I felt heat rising in my cheeks, the familiar burn of public embarrassment. But something in her tone, something beyond the usual academic criticism, made me look up at her face. There was satisfaction there, a gleam that suggested this moment was somehow personally gratifying for her. Perhaps, she continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly quiet room, some students simply need to accept their limitations. Not everyone is cut out for the rigors of advanced mathematical thinking. Amanda Fitzgerald, sitting 2 seats away, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. The male students in the class suddenly became very interested in their notebooks. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. I finished the exam review session in a haze of humiliation, mechanically taking notes while my mind replayed those words over and over. After class, I approached Chen's desk where she was gathering her materials with characteristic efficiency. "Professor Chen, could I speak with you about my performance in the class?" She looked up at me with an expression that suggested I was interrupting something far more important. "Miss Rodriguez, I think we both know where this conversation is heading. Your exam scores speak for themselves. I've been working with Dr. Peterson, and I feel like I'm starting to understand the material better. I was wondering if there might be additional resources or alternative approaches that could help me improve." Chen closed her briefcase with a sharp snap and stood up to face me directly. What happened next would replay in my mind thousands of times over the following years, each repetition burning the memory deeper into my consciousness. "Miss Rodriguez, I'm going to be frank with you because I believe in honest communication, even when it's difficult to hear." Her voice was measured, clinical, as if she were delivering a medical diagnosis. "In my 20 years of teaching advanced mathematics, I have observed certain patterns. Women, generally speaking, approach mathematical problems differently than men. This isn't necessarily a criticism. Different doesn't always mean inferior." I felt my stomach drop, but I forced myself to maintain eye contact. "However," she continued, adjusting her glasses when we reached the level of abstract thinking required for advanced algebra and beyond, "these differences become more pronounced. Women tend to rely more heavily on procedural approaches, on memorization and pattern recognition, rather than the kind of intuitive leap that advanced mathematics demands." The words felt like physical blows, but she wasn't finished. "Your performance in this class, frankly, supports this observation. You work hard, I don't question your dedication, but hard work alone cannot compensate for fundamental limitations in cognitive architecture. Women simply don't possess the same capacity for the kind of abstract reasoning that mathematics requires at this level." The hallway around us had gone completely quiet. I realized that other students, packing up their belongings from nearby classrooms, had slowed their movements to listen. Amanda Fitzgerald was still sitting at her desk, her face flushed with embarrassment that seemed to be directed not at Chen, but at me for putting her in the position of witnessing this conversation. "I don't believe that's true," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. Chen's smile was thin and cold. "Belief is irrelevant, Miss Rodriguez. Mathematics is about proof, about empirical evidence. Your exam scores are data points. The gender distribution in advanced mathematics programs is a data point. The historical record of mathematical achievement is a data point. When you examine the evidence objectively, the conclusion becomes inevitable." She paused, seeming to consider her next words carefully. "I'm not trying to be cruel. In fact, I'm trying to save you from years of frustration and disappointment. There are many valuable careers in mathematics education, in applied statistics, in fields where your particular strengths would be better utilized. But pure mathematics, particularly at the research level, requires a specific type of cognitive ability that appears to be distributed unequally across gender lines." The hallway was spinning slightly around the edges. I gripped the back of a chair to steady myself. "It's not personal, Miss Rodriguez. It's biology." Those 4 words hit me like a physical blow. The casual dismissal, the reduction of my dreams and aspirations to a simple biological limitation, the implication that my struggles were not due to inadequate teaching or insufficient preparation, but to fundamental flaws in my female brain. I don't remember leaving the building. The next thing I was aware of was sitting on a bench outside the mathematics library, staring at my hands while students walked past in both directions. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the campus, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the sound of construction, the rhythmic pounding of machinery that seemed to echo the pulsing in my temples. My phone buzzed with a text message from my mother. "How was your day, Mia? Hope your classes went well." I stared at the message for a long time before turning the phone off without responding. That night, I called my grandmother. Abuela Carmen had always been my refuge during difficult times, the person who made sense of the world when everything else felt chaotic. She listened without interruption as I told her about Chen's words, about the humiliation, about the growing certainty that maybe I had been fooling myself all along. Elena, she said when I finally stopped talking, her voice carrying the weight of 78 years of accumulated wisdom. When I came to this country, I spoke no English. The woman at the employment office told me that people like me were only good for cleaning floors and washing dishes. She said it wasn't personal, it was just the way things were. She paused, and I could hear the sound of her stirring something on the stove. So I cleaned floors for 2 years while I learned English at night. Then I worked in a factory for 5 years while I saved money to open my bakery. And now, 40 years later, that same employment office sends people to me when they need recommendations for small business loans. But Abuela, what if Professor Chen is right?
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
What if I really don't have what it takes? Mija, let me ask you something. When you solve a mathematics problem, when you finally understand a concept that was giving you trouble, how does it feel? I thought about it for a moment. Like coming home. Like finding something that was always there, waiting for me to discover it. And you think that feeling, that connection, that gift, is limited by what's between your legs. Despite everything, I almost smiled. Abuela had never been one for delicate language. Professor Chen has achieved great things, she continued. But perhaps she has forgotten that the door was once closed to her too. Sometimes the people who climb the highest walls forget to throw down a ladder for those coming behind them. After we hung up, I sat in my dorm room staring at my abstract algebra textbook. The pages were filled with my handwritten notes, margin comments, small diagrams, and alternative proofs that I had developed while working through problems. Despite Chen's assessment, I could see the beauty in these abstract structures. I could feel the logical connections forming in my mind, like bridges spanning impossible distances. But doubt had taken root, growing like a parasite that fed on every mistake, every moment of confusion, every sideways glance from classmates who seemed to navigate these concepts with effortless grace. The next morning, I went to the registrar's office to inquire about withdrawing from Chen's class. The woman behind the counter was sympathetic but thorough in explaining the consequences. Withdrawing would mean losing credits I needed for graduation, potentially pushing back my timeline by a full semester. More importantly, it would leave a permanent mark on my transcript, a glaring admission of defeat that would follow me through graduate school applications and beyond. "Are you sure you want to do this?" she asked, her finger hovering over the computer keyboard. "It's still relatively early in the semester. Sometimes students find that things improve once they adjust to a professor's teaching style." I thought about Chen's words, about the certainty in her voice when she delivered her verdict on my cognitive limitations. I thought about the snickers from male classmates who had watched my public humiliation with what seemed like satisfaction. I thought about Amanda Fitzgerald, who had somehow earned Chen's approval despite being just as female as I was. "I need to think about it," I said finally. That afternoon I found myself in Dr. Peterson's office hours, not with specific questions about homework, but with a deeper need to understand what was happening to me. "I keep wondering if maybe Professor Chen is right," I admitted, the words feeling like glass in my throat. "Maybe I'm just not equipped for this level of mathematics." Dr. Peterson leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his hair in a gesture I had come to recognize as his way of buying time to formulate a response. "Elena, can I tell you something that I probably shouldn't tell you?" I nodded. Professor Chen said similar things to me when I was taking her class. Not about gender, obviously, but about my fundamental unsuitability for advanced mathematics. She told me I lacked the intuitive grasp necessary for original research, that I should consider focusing on mathematics education rather than pursuing a doctorate. My eyes widened. Dr. Peterson was widely regarded as one of the most promising graduate students in the department. His research on algebraic topology had already attracted attention from professors at other universities. "But you're brilliant," I said. "Your work is groundbreaking." "I'm competent," he corrected. "I work hard, I think carefully, and I don't give up easily." But according to Chen's assessment, None of that was sufficient to overcome my apparent cognitive limitations. He leaned forward, his expression serious. Here's what I learned. Professor Chen has very specific ideas about what mathematical talent looks like. If you don't fit her template, if your mind works differently than hers does, she interprets that as evidence of inadequacy rather than diversity. But what about Amanda Fitzgerald? Chen seems to approve of her. Peterson's expression grew uncomfortable. Amanda fits a particular profile. Her father is Richard Fitzgerald at Yale. She grew up surrounded by academic mathematics, speaking the language from childhood. She presents ideas in a way that matches Chen's expectations because she learned those patterns from birth. The implication hung in the air between us. You're saying Chen's evaluation isn't really about ability at all. I'm saying that talent comes in many forms, and the ability to recognize and nurture different types of mathematical thinking is what separates great teachers from mediocre ones. That evening, I called my high school calculus teacher, Mrs. Chen. She had been the one to encourage me to take college-level mathematics courses, the first person to suggest that I had genuine mathematical ability. Elena, how wonderful to hear from you. How are your studies going? I told her about Columbia, about Professor Chen, about the growing certainty that I had made a terrible mistake in pursuing pure mathematics. Mrs. Chen listened patiently, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly just letting me talk through my doubts and fears. Do you remember the first proof you ever wrote? She asked, when I had finished. I smiled despite everything. The proof that there are infinitely many prime numbers. And how did you feel when you finally understood it, when all the pieces clicked into place? Like I had discovered something magical, like I had been let in on one of the universe's secrets. That feeling, Elena, that moment of mathematical insight, that's not something that can be taught or faked. Either you have the capacity for that kind of understanding, or you don't. And based on everything I observed during your time in my class, you have it in abundance. But what if Professor Chen is right? What if there are biological limitations that prevent women from reaching the highest levels of mathematical achievement? Mrs. Chen was quiet for a long moment. Elena, I've been teaching mathematics for 35 years. I've seen thousands of students, male and female, struggle with these concepts. The students who succeed aren't necessarily the ones with the highest test scores or the quickest computational abilities. They're the ones who persist through confusion, who ask questions when they don't understand, who see beauty in abstract structures that others find intimidating. She paused. More importantly, they're the ones who refuse to let other people's limitations become their own. Professor Chen may be brilliant, but her inability to recognize different forms of mathematical talent says more about her limitations than about yours. After our conversation, I spent hours walking around campus, trying to sort through the conflicting voices in my head. The rational part of my mind knew that Chen's assessment was both unfair and unscientific, but the emotional damage had been done. Every time I looked at a mathematics problem, I heard her voice questioning whether my female brain was capable of the necessary abstract reasoning. The internal battle continued for weeks. I would have good days when the material seemed to make sense, when I could work through problems with something approaching my old confidence. But then I would hit a difficult concept, struggle with a proof, or earn a poor grade on an assignment, and Chen's words would come flooding back. The worst part was the isolation. My male classmates seemed to navigate these challenges with an assurance I envied. When they struggled, they framed it as a temporary setback, a difficult concept that required additional study. When I struggled, I wondered if I was encountering the ceiling of my cognitive abilities. Amanda Fitzgerald made matters worse, not through any deliberate cruelty, but through the casual confidence with which she approached the material. She would raise her hand to answer questions that left me confused, offer insights that seemed to come from some deep well of intuitive understanding. Watching her succeed only reinforced the growing suspicion that maybe Chen was right about me, even if her generalizations about women were wrong. The third exam was a disaster that made my previous failures look like minor setbacks. I scored 28%, a grade so low that it seemed to confirm every doubt that had been planted in my mind. When Chen handed back the exam, she included a handwritten note suggesting that I make an appointment to discuss my academic future. That night, I sat in my dorm room staring at the exam, trying to understand where I had gone wrong. The problems were challenging, but not beyond my capabilities. I had studied extensively, worked through similar examples, felt reasonably confident walking into the test. Yet somehow, under the pressure of Chen's evaluation, my mind had simply frozen. Jessica found me there at 3 in the morning, still staring at the red ink that covered my failed attempts at proof. "Elena, this is insane, you need to sleep." "I think I'm going to drop out," I said without looking up from the paper. "Drop the class. Drop out of mathematics entirely. Maybe Professor Chen is right, maybe I've been fooling myself all along." Jessica sat down on her bed, facing me with an expression of concern I had never seen before. "Elena, I've watched you work for 2 years. I've seen you solve problems that make my pre-med coursework look like elementary arithmetic. I've watched you explain concepts to other students in ways that made everything suddenly clear. If you don't belong in mathematics, then nobody does. But the evidence is right here," I said, holding up the failed exam. "I can't perform when it matters. I can't think under pressure. Maybe those are the limitations Chen was talking about. Or maybe you're being evaluated by someone who doesn't know how to teach, who mistakes her own failings for your limitations." I wanted to believe her, but the weight of accumulated failure was becoming impossible to bear. The next morning, I made an appointment to see Professor Chen during her office hours. Chen's office felt smaller than usual, the mathematical journals on her shelves seeming to lean in like silent witnesses to my academic execution. She gestured for me to sit in the same uncomfortable chair where I had received so many discouraging assessments over the past months. "Miss Rodriguez, I assume you're here to discuss your exam performance." I nodded, not trusting my voice. "I think we both know that this conversation has been inevitable for some time. Your scores have been consistently below the level required for success in advanced mathematics. More concerning is the trend. Rather than improving with additional study and support, your performance has actually declined." She opened a folder containing what I assumed were my graded assignments and exams. "I want to be clear that this is not a reflection of your work ethic. You've been diligent in attending office hours, conscientious about completing assignments, clearly dedicated to mastering this material. Unfortunately, dedication alone cannot overcome fundamental cognitive limitations." There were those words again, fundamental cognitive limitations, delivered with the same clinical detachment as before. "I've been thinking about our previous conversation," she continued, "and I believe I was not sufficiently direct in my assessment. It's not fair to you to allow this struggle to continue when the outcome is predetermined." I forced myself to look up at her face, to meet her eyes directly. "Professor Chen, I don't understand. Amanda Fitzgerald seems to handle the material so much better than I do, if gender is really the determining factor here." Chen's expression shifted slightly, as if she were considering whether to answer the question directly. "Miss Fitzgerald comes from a different background. Her father is a prominent mathematician. She grew up in an environment where abstract thinking was cultivated from an early age. More importantly, she represents an exception that proves the rule. For every Amanda Fitzgerald, there are dozens of young women who struggle exactly as you have struggled. But what if those women are struggling because of inadequate teaching methods, or because they're being discouraged by professors who don't believe in their abilities?" Chen's smile was thin and condescending. "Miss Rodriguez, I understand the appeal of that explanation. It's much more comfortable to believe that external factors are responsible for your difficulties than to accept that you may simply lack the necessary aptitude. But comfort is not the same as truth." She leaned forward slightly. "The truth is that mathematical ability, particularly at the advanced level, requires a specific type of cognitive architecture. Spatial reasoning, abstract pattern recognition, the ability to manipulate complex logical structures in working memory. These are measurable cognitive functions, and they show consistent gender differences across multiple studies. Those differences are statistical averages," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "They don't determine what any individual person is capable of achieving. In theory, you're correct. But in practice, when we see consistent patterns of performance that align with predicted cognitive differences, we have to acknowledge the reality of biological limitations." Chen closed the folder and looked at me with an expression that might have been intended as kindness. Miss Rodriguez, you are clearly an intelligent young woman with many valuable qualities. But intelligence comes in many forms, and not all forms are suited for advanced mathematical research. Women often excel in fields that require different types of cognitive abilities: communication, nurturing, detailed organizational thinking. Perhaps it's time to consider redirecting your academic focus toward areas where your particular strengths would be better utilized. The suggestion hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Everything about her tone and word choice was designed to sound supportive and encouraging, but underneath the professional veneer was the same message she had been delivering from the beginning. Your dreams are unrealistic, your aspirations exceed your biological capabilities. I don't accept that, I heard myself saying. Chen's eyebrows rose slightly. I'm sorry, I don't accept your assessment. I don't accept the premise that my gender determines my mathematical ability. And I don't accept that my struggles in your class prove anything about women's cognitive limitations. For the first time since I had known her, Professor Chen looked genuinely surprised. Miss Rodriguez, I understand that this is difficult to hear, but denial is not going to change the fundamental realities we're discussing. It's not denial, I said, standing up from the uncomfortable chair. It's recognition that your evaluation process is fundamentally flawed. I walked toward the door, then turned back to face her one final time. You know what, Professor Chen, you're right about one thing. This conversation was inevitable, but not for the reasons you think. I left her office with my hands shaking and my heart pounding, but for the first time in months the shaking wasn't from fear or humiliation. It was from anger, pure and focused and more energizing than any emotion I had ever experienced. That night, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of my entire life. I was not going to drop Professor Chen's class. I was not going to accept her assessment of my limitations. I was not going to allow her narrow definition of mathematical ability to determine my future. Instead, I was going to prove her wrong, not just for myself, but for every woman who had ever been told that her dreams exceeded her biological capabilities. For every young girl who would sit in a mathematics classroom and wonder if she belonged there. For every brilliant mind that had been dismissed because it didn't fit someone else's template of what genius looked like. I had 4 weeks left in the semester. 4 weeks to demonstrate that Professor Chen's theories about women and mathematics were not just wrong, but dangerously destructive. 4 weeks to show that determination and proper understanding could overcome any supposed cognitive limitation. 4 weeks to begin a journey that would ultimately reshape everything Chen thought she knew about mathematical ability, gender, and the price of underestimating the wrong person. I walked back to my dorm room that night, with purpose burning in my chest like a flame that would never be extinguished. The real story was just beginning. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my desk with every mathematics textbook I owned spread across the surface like battle plans. The anger that had carried me out of Chen's office was still burning, but now it had crystallized into something more useful: absolute determination. I pulled out a notebook and wrote 3 words at the top of the first page. Prove her wrong. The next morning, I did something I had never done before in my entire academic career. I went to the library before it officially opened, waiting outside the doors until the security guard let me in with a curious look. I had exactly 27 days until the final exam, 27 days to demonstrate that everything Professor Chen believed about women and mathematics was not just incorrect, but dangerously misguided. My first stop was the mathematics department's graduate student lounge, a cramped room filled with mismatched furniture and the permanent smell of coffee that had been brewing too long. I found Marcus Webb, a doctoral student whose dissertation on algebraic geometry had earned him a reputation as one of the department's rising stars. Marcus was the kind of person who spoke in mathematical notation when he got excited, who could see elegant solutions where others saw impenetrable complexity. Elena, right, you're in Chen's abstract algebra class. Marcus looked up from the paper he was grading, his pen still poised over what appeared to be an undergraduate's attempt at group theory. I need help, I said, without preamble. Not just tutoring, I need someone to teach me how to think like a mathematician. Marcus set down his pen and studied my face with the intensity he usually reserved for particularly challenging proofs. That's a pretty specific request. What brought this on? I told him about Chen's assessment, about her theories regarding women and cognitive limitations, about the crushing weight of repeated failure that had nearly driven me to abandon mathematics entirely. Marcus listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly troubled as I recounted Chen's words. "Jesus," he said when I finished. I knew Chen could be harsh, but he shook his head. "That's not just bad teaching, Elena. That's actively destructive. Can you help me?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at the stack of papers on his desk as if they contained the answer to my question. "Here's the thing about advanced mathematics," he said finally. "It's not really about being smarter than everyone else. It's about developing a particular way of seeing patterns, of building intuition for abstract structures." Chen's teaching style assumes that students already possess this intuition, that they can leap directly from definition to insight without scaffolding. He stood up and walked to the whiteboard that dominated one wall of the lounge. "But intuition can be built. Mathematical thinking can be trained. It just requires a different approach than what Chen provides." Marcus began writing on the board, not equations or proofs, but a kind of roadmap for mathematical development. "We're going to completely reconstruct your understanding of abstract algebra from the ground up. Not just memorizing definitions and theorems, but understanding why these structures exist, what problems they solve, how they connect to bigger mathematical ideas." Over the following weeks, Marcus became my mathematical mentor in ways that went far beyond traditional tutoring. We met every morning at 7, before the lounge filled with other graduate students, and worked through problems with a methodical intensity that would have impressed even Chen. But unlike Chen's approach, Marcus focused on building understanding rather than exposing ignorance. "Stop trying to memorize," he would say when he caught me reciting definitions. "Start asking why. Why do we define groups this way? What would happen if we changed one of the axioms? What real-world phenomena do these abstract structures help us understand?" The transformation wasn't immediate. For the first week, I felt like I was learning a completely new language, one where familiar words like groups and field and ring carried meanings that were simultaneously precise and infinitely flexible. But gradually, something began to shift in my understanding. The abstract structures that had seemed arbitrary and intimidating started to reveal their underlying logic. Marcus introduced me to other graduate students who became willing participants in my mathematical rehabilitation. Sarah Chen, no relation to the professor, was working on number theory and had an extraordinary gift for explaining complex concepts through carefully chosen analogies. David Rodriguez, whose shared surname led to jokes about our being mathematical siblings, specialized in topology and could visualize geometric relationships that existed in dimensions beyond human perception. Together, they created an informal study group that met 3 times a week in the basement of the mathematics building. The room was technically a storage space for old furniture, but it had a working whiteboard and enough space for 5 or 6 people to spread out their books and papers. More importantly, it was a space where questions were welcomed rather than punished, where struggling with a concept was seen as a natural part of the learning process rather than evidence of inadequacy. The dirty secret about mathematics, Sarah told me during one of our evening sessions, is that everyone struggles. Even the people who make it look effortless have spent countless hours wrestling with ideas that initially made no sense to them. The difference between success and failure isn't natural ability, it's persistence and access to good teaching. I began to see the truth in her words as I watched my study group colleagues work through problems. Marcus might stare at a proof for 20 minutes before seeing the crucial insight. David would fill entire pages with diagrams and false starts before finding the correct approach. Sarah would talk through problems aloud, sometimes arguing with herself as she worked through different possibilities. But Chen's class remained a source of frustration and anxiety. Despite my growing understanding of the material, her teaching style continued to emphasize speed over comprehension, performance over learning. During lectures, I would understand the concepts we had covered in study group, but Chen's presentation was so rapid and unforgiving that I still struggled to keep up. The 4th exam was my first real test of whether the intensive study approach was working. I walked into Chen's classroom with more confidence than I had felt in months, armed with a deep understanding of the material, rather than surface-level memorization. The problems were challenging, but for the first time, I could see the underlying patterns, could identify which tools were needed to construct each proof. When Chen handed back the exams a week later, I searched through the stack with trembling hands. My score was 72%, not perfect, but a passing grade, and more importantly, evidence that my understanding was fundamentally sound. Chen's expression when she handed me the paper was unreadable. "Improvement," she said simply, but there was something in her tone that suggested this development was unexpected and possibly unwelcome. After class, I practically ran to the graduate student lounge to share the news with Marcus. He looked at my exam with the same careful attention he gave to his own research, noting not just the correct answers, but the approach I had taken to each problem. "This is excellent work, Elena. Look at this proof here. You've used a technique that's actually more elegant than the standard approach. That shows real mathematical maturity." But even as I celebrated this small victory, I knew that one passing grade wasn't enough to prove Chen wrong. I needed something more dramatic, more undeniable. I needed to demonstrate not just that I could pass her class, but that her entire framework for understanding mathematical ability was fundamentally flawed. The opportunity came from an unexpected source. Patricia Williams, the department chair, had instituted a new tradition of undergraduate research presentations, where exceptional students could present original mathematical work to faculty and graduate students. The presentations were voluntary, but they carried significant weight for students applying to graduate programs. "You should present," Marcus suggested when the announcement was posted. "You've been developing some interesting insights about the connections between group theory and linear algebra. That could make for a compelling presentation." The idea terrified me. Standing up in front of the entire mathematics faculty, including Chen, to present my own mathematical ideas felt like the ultimate test of whether I truly belonged in this world. But it also represented an opportunity to demonstrate that women could not only understand advanced mathematics, but could contribute original insights to the field. I spent 3 weeks developing my presentation, working with Marcus and the study group to refine my ideas and anticipate potential questions. The central concept was deceptively simple. I had noticed patterns in the way certain group operations could be represented through matrix transformations, connections that seemed to bridge abstract algebra and linear algebra in ways that could simplify complex proofs. "The beautiful thing about this insight," Sarah observed during one of our preparation sessions, "is that it's not something you could just memorize or regurgitate. This is original mathematical thinking." The night before the presentation, I called my grandmother. Abuela Carmen listened as I explained what I was about to attempt, the risks and the potential rewards of standing up in front of Chen and her colleagues to defend my mathematical ideas. "Mija," she said, when I finished, "do you remember when you were little, how you used to rearrange the ingredients in my kitchen to make them more organized? You would group the spices by color, arrange the flour and sugar by height, create these perfect little systems that made sense to you." I smiled, remembering those long afternoons in her warm kitchen, finding order in chaos. "That's what you're doing now, isn't it? Looking at these mathematical ideas and seeing patterns that other people haven't noticed. Finding ways to organize knowledge that make everything clearer. But what if I'm wrong? What if my ideas don't hold up under scrutiny? Then you'll learn something new, and you'll try again. That's what mathematicians do, isn't it? They propose ideas, test them, refine them. The only real failure would be staying silent when you have something valuable to contribute." The mathematics department's main lecture hall was more intimidating than I had remembered. 23 faculty members and 30 graduate students filled the space, their collective attention focused on the small podium where I would soon stand to defend my work. Chen sat in the third row, her expression as unreadable as ever, flanked by colleagues whose reputations in algebraic research were known throughout the mathematical community. Dr. Williams introduced me with kind words about academic courage and the importance of undergraduate research. Then I was alone at the podium, facing an audience that included some of the most brilliant mathematical minds in the country. The relationship between group theory and linear algebra has been extensively studied. I began, my voice steadier than I had expected. But I believe there are unexplored connections that can provide new insights into both fields. For the next 20 minutes, I walked through my ideas step by step. I demonstrated how certain group operations could be elegantly represented through matrix transformations, showed how this perspective could simplify proofs that were traditionally considered quite complex, and suggested applications that could extend beyond pure mathematics into areas like cryptography and computer science. The audience was attentive but silent, their faces revealing nothing about their assessment of my work. When I finished my presentation, Dr. Williams opened the floor for questions. The first question came from Dr. Harrison, whose work on representation theory was legendary in the field. Ms. Rodriguez, your approach to this matrix representation is intriguing, but I'm curious about the computational complexity. Have you considered how this method scales with larger group structures? I had anticipated this question and was able to provide a detailed response, including preliminary calculations that suggested the approach remained efficient even for complex cases. Dr. Harrison nodded approvingly and made notes on the paper in front of him. More questions followed, each one probing different aspects of my work, testing the limits of my understanding. I fielded inquiries about potential applications, theoretical limitations, connections to existing research, and possible extensions of the central ideas. With each response, I felt my confidence growing. These weren't the hostile interrogations I had expected, but genuine intellectual exchanges with scholars who were taking my ideas seriously. Finally, Chen raised her hand. Miss Rodriguez, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet room, your presentation demonstrates a competent understanding of the material. However, I'm curious about the originality of these insights. Are you certain that these connections haven't been explored in the existing literature? The question was phrased politely, but I could hear the underlying challenge. Chen was suggesting that my work might be derivative, that I might have unknowingly recreated insights that already existed in the mathematical canon. Professor Chen, I've conducted an extensive literature review, and while there are certainly precedents for some of these ideas, I believe the specific approach I'm proposing represents a novel synthesis. Dr. Peterson has been helping me verify the originality of the work, and we're confident that this perspective offers new contributions to the field. Chen's expression remained neutral, but I noticed her slight nod toward Dr. Peterson, who was sitting in the back row. The implied request for confirmation was clear. That's correct, Dr. Peterson said, standing up to address the room. I've reviewed Elena's work carefully, and while it builds on established foundations, the central insights are original. More importantly, the applications she's suggesting could have significant practical value. The room fell silent again. I realized that something important was happening, that this exchange between Chen and Peterson was about more than just my research. It was a public disagreement between faculty members about the value and originality of my work. Dr. Williams stepped forward to fill the silence. Thank you, Ms. Rodriguez. This has been an impressive presentation. I think I speak for everyone when I say that your research demonstrates exactly the kind of innovative thinking we hope to see from our undergraduate students. The applause that followed was warm and sustained. As I gathered my notes and prepared to leave the podium, I caught sight of Chen's face. For the first time since I had known her, she looked genuinely surprised, as if something had happened that didn't fit her expectations. After the presentation, I was surrounded by faculty and graduate students who wanted to discuss my ideas in more detail. Dr. Harrison mentioned potential applications in his own research. Sarah talked about connections to number theory that I hadn't considered. Marcus beamed with the pride of a mentor, whose student had exceeded all expectations. But the conversation that mattered most came from Dr. Williams herself. Elena, could I speak with you privately for a moment? We stepped into a quiet corner of the lecture hall while the crowd gradually dispersed. That was exceptional work, Dr. Williams said. Not just the mathematical content, which was impressive, but the presentation itself. You handled those questions with the poise of a graduate student. Thank you, Dr. Williams. This means everything to me. I want to discuss your future plans. Have you considered pursuing graduate study in mathematics? The question caught me off guard. After months of struggling in Chen's class, after being told repeatedly that I lacked the fundamental capabilities for advanced mathematical thinking, the idea of continuing in mathematics had seemed increasingly unlikely. "I'm not sure I'm qualified for graduate school," I admitted. "My performance in Professor Chen's class has been challenging." Dr. Williams frowned slightly. "Elena, I've been observing your work for some time now. Your research presentation today demonstrated mathematical insight that goes far beyond what we typically see at the undergraduate level. Whatever difficulties you've experienced in one particular class don't reflect your overall potential in the field." She paused, seeming to consider her next words carefully. "Between you and me, Professor Chen's teaching methods are not universally effective. She's a brilliant researcher, but she has very specific ideas about how mathematical talent manifests itself. Students who don't fit her particular template sometimes struggle in her classes despite having exceptional ability." The validation was overwhelming. After months of questioning my own capabilities, of wondering whether Chen's assessment was accurate, hearing these words from the department chair felt like emerging from a long tunnel into bright sunlight. "I would like to encourage you to apply for our graduate program," Dr. Williams continued. "With work like what you presented today, you would be a strong candidate for admission and funding." That evening, I called my mother to tell her about the presentation. Isabella listened with the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for medical emergencies, asking questions about details she couldn't possibly understand, but somehow grasping the significance of what had happened. "Mija, I am so proud of you. Not just because you did well today, but because you didn't give up when things got difficult. That professor who said those terrible things about women, she was wrong about you." "I think she was wrong about a lot of things, Mama." After we hung up, I sat in my dorm room, thinking about the day's events. The presentation had been a success beyond my wildest expectations, but more importantly, it had proven something that Chen had tried to convince me was impossible, that women could not only understand advanced mathematics, but could contribute original insights to the field. But I wasn't satisfied with proving Chen wrong about me personally. I wanted to challenge the entire framework of assumptions that had led her to dismiss not just my potential but the potential of women in mathematics more generally. Over the following weeks, I began developing a plan that would extend far beyond my own academic success. I started researching the history of women in mathematics, documenting the systematic barriers that had prevented female mathematicians from receiving recognition for their contributions. I studied the work of brilliant women, like Emmy Noether, Sofia Kovalevskaya, and Hypatia, mathematicians whose achievements had been overlooked or attributed to male colleagues. I also began investigating the current state of gender representation in academic mathematics. The statistics were sobering. Women earned only 25% of mathematics doctoral degrees, held fewer than 15% of tenured positions in research universities, and were dramatically underrepresented in the most prestigious areas of pure mathematical research. But the most revealing research came from studies of gender bias in academic evaluation. Multiple experiments had demonstrated that identical work was rated more highly when attributed to male authors than to female authors, that letters of recommendation for women emphasized effort and persistence while letters for men emphasized brilliance and natural ability. The pattern was clear: the barriers facing women in mathematics weren't primarily biological or cognitive, but cultural and institutional. Chen's assessment of my limitations wasn't based on objective evaluation of mathematical ability, but on unconscious biases that had been shaped by centuries of exclusion. Armed with this knowledge, I began formulating a plan that would not only complete my own academic vindication, but would challenge the systemic inequities that continued to discourage women from pursuing careers in mathematics. The final exam in Chen's class was scheduled for the last week of the semester. I had been studying with an intensity that worried even Marcus, working through practice problems until I could solve them in my sleep, reviewing theorems until I could recite them perfectly, preparing for what felt like the ultimate test of everything I had learned. But I also had a larger goal in mind. I didn't just want to pass Chen's exam, I wanted to earn the highest score in the class, to demonstrate conclusively that her theories about women and mathematical ability were not just wrong, but dangerously misguided. The night before the exam, I received an unexpected email from Dr. Williams. The subject line read, graduate school application, and when I opened the message, I found a formal invitation to apply for the mathematics doctoral program, along with information about a special fellowship for students from underrepresented backgrounds. Elena, the email read, "Your research presentation has generated considerable interest among our faculty. We would very much like to have you continue your mathematical studies here at Columbia. Please consider applying for our program. I believe you have the potential to make significant contributions to the field." I printed the email and pinned it to the bulletin board above my desk, where it would serve as a reminder of how far I had come from that devastating moment in Chen's office months earlier. The final exam was scheduled for 3 hours on a Friday morning. I arrived early, as had become my custom, and spent the final minutes reviewing key theorems and proof techniques. When Chen entered the classroom, carrying the stack of exam booklets, I felt a familiar flutter of nervousness, but it was tempered by confidence built through months of intensive study. "You have 3 hours," Chen announced as she distributed the exams. "The problems are challenging, but they cover material we have discussed throughout the semester. Show your work clearly, state your assumptions explicitly, and remember that partial credit is available for well-reasoned approaches, even if your final answers are incorrect." I opened the exam booklet and scanned the problems quickly. There were 5 questions, each worth 20 points, covering the major topics we had studied: group theory, ring theory, field theory, and Galois theory. The problems were indeed challenging, requiring not just memorization of definitions and theorems, but deep understanding of the underlying mathematical structures. But as I read through each question, I felt the satisfying click of recognition. These weren't arbitrary puzzles designed to confuse or intimidate. They were logical extensions of concepts I had spent months understanding from every possible angle. Thanks to Marcus and the study group, I could see not just what each problem was asking, but why it was important, how it connected to broader mathematical themes. I began with the group theory problem, a complex question about homomorphisms and quotient groups that would have terrified me at the beginning of the semester. Now I could visualize the abstract structures involved, could trace the logical steps needed to construct a rigorous proof. My hand moved steadily across the page, building the arguments step by step with a confidence I had never felt in Chen's class before. The ring theory problem required a careful analysis of polynomial rings and their ideals. Again, the intensive study sessions had prepared me well. I could recall not just the relevant theorems, but the intuitive understanding of why those theorems were true, what they revealed about the nature of algebraic structures. As I worked through each problem, I became aware of something remarkable happening. The mathematics was flowing naturally, elegantly, without the struggle and confusion that had characterized my earlier work in the class. The concepts that had once seemed arbitrary and intimidating now felt like old friends, familiar tools that I could use to explore new mathematical territory. By the time I reached the final problem, a challenging question about Galois theory that required synthesizing material from the entire semester, I was working with the kind of focused intensity I had only previously experienced during my research presentation. The solution emerged gradually, built from careful application of fundamental principles, supported by clear reasoning and rigorous proof techniques. When I finished the exam with 30 minutes remaining, I used the extra time to review my work carefully, checking calculations, clarifying explanations, ensuring that every step of every proof was as clear and complete as possible. As I handed in my exam booklet, Chen looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "How did it go, Miss Rodriguez?" "Well, I think the problems were challenging, but fair," Chen nodded and made a note in her grade book. "We'll see." 3 days later, Chen posted the final grades outside her office. I found my student ID number near the top of the list, next to a score that made me blink twice to ensure I was reading correctly. 96%. It was the highest score in the class. Standing in that hallway, staring at the evidence of my academic transformation, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 6 months earlier, I had been ready to abandon mathematics entirely, convinced that Chen's assessment of my limitations was accurate. Now I was holding the highest score on her final exam, preparing to apply for graduate school, and armed with research that could challenge the systemic biases that continued to discourage women from pursuing careers in mathematics. But this was only the beginning. Chen's theories about women and mathematical ability weren't just personally hurtful, they were professionally destructive, potentially discouraging countless young women from developing their mathematical talents. Proving her wrong about me was satisfying, but it wasn't enough. I had bigger plans, plans that would extend far beyond my own academic success, and address the systemic inequities that Chen's attitudes represented. Plans that would ensure that no other young woman would face the kind of discouragement I had experienced, that future generations of female mathematicians would be evaluated based on their abilities rather than their gender. The real work was just beginning. 5 years later, I stood at the podium of the International Congress of Mathematicians in Rio de Janeiro, looking out at 3,000 of the world's most brilliant mathematical minds. The invitation to deliver a plenary lecture at ICM was the highest honor in mathematics, typically reserved for Fields Medal winners and researchers whose work had fundamentally reshaped entire fields of study. I was 31 years old, the youngest woman ever invited to give a plenary address, and my research on categorical representations of algebraic structures had already been cited in over 200 papers. But none of that mattered as much as the single face I spotted in the 5th row of the auditorium. Professor Margaret Chen sat perfectly still, her expression unreadable behind those familiar wire-rimmed glasses. She had aged in the years since I graduated from Columbia, her hair now completely silver, but her posture retained the same rigid authority I remembered from those devastating days in her classroom. The history of mathematics, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the vast auditorium, is littered with brilliant minds whose contributions were overlooked, dismissed or attributed to others, because they didn't fit conventional expectations of what mathematical genius looks like. I clicked to my first slide, showing portraits of Emmy Noether, Hypatia, and Sofia Kovalevskaya, alongside their mathematical achievements.
Today I want to discuss not just the mathematics that emerges when we expand our definition of talent, but the systematic changes needed to ensure that future generations of mathematicians are evaluated based on their ideas rather than their demographics. The presentation that followed was the culmination of 8 years of research that had begun in Chen's classroom. My doctoral work at MIT had focused on developing new frameworks for understanding algebraic structures, but the deeper project had always been about challenging the institutional biases that limited access to mathematical careers. The mathematical content was groundbreaking. I had developed new categorical approaches that simplified complex proofs, created computational tools that were already being used by researchers worldwide, and established theoretical frameworks that were opening entirely new areas of investigation. But the real power of my work lay in how it had been developed. Every significant result had emerged from collaborative research with teams that prioritized diverse perspectives over traditional hierarchies. My laboratory at Stanford, where I had been hired as an associate professor at 28, included researchers from 15 different countries, with gender parity and explicit attention to creating inclusive environments where unconventional approaches were valued. The mathematics we've accomplished, I continued, clicking through slides showing our latest results, demonstrates that innovation flourishes when we create space for different types of mathematical thinking. The categorical frameworks I'm presenting today emerged from collaborative work that intentionally sought out perspectives that traditional academic structures often overlook. I could see Chen taking notes, her pen moving with the same mechanical precision I remembered from graduate school. The irony wasn't lost on me that she was now documenting insights that had emerged directly from rejecting her fundamental assumptions about mathematical ability. During the question period that followed, I fielded inquiries from some of the most respected mathematicians in the world. The questions were technical, probing, designed to test the limits of my understanding, but they were also respectful, treating my work as a serious contribution to mathematical knowledge rather than an anomaly requiring explanation. When the session ended, I was surrounded by colleagues eager to discuss potential collaborations. The work I had presented opened up new research directions that would keep mathematical communities busy for decades. But through the crowd, I noticed Chen making her way toward me with deliberate steps. "Dr. Rodriguez," she said, when she finally reached me, extending her hand with formal politeness. "Congratulations on an impressive presentation." "Thank you, Professor Chen. I wasn't expecting to see you here. I make it a point to attend presentations by former students when they achieve significant recognition. Her tone was neutral, professional, giving no indication of whether she remembered our previous interactions. "I was hoping we might have a chance to speak privately," I said. "Perhaps over coffee tomorrow morning?" Chen hesitated for a moment, studying my face with the same analytical intensity she had once directed toward my struggling proofs. "Of course, there's a cafe near the convention center." 9 o'clock. The next morning, I arrived early and chose a table near the window where the morning light would illuminate both our faces clearly. Chen appeared precisely at 9, carrying a leather portfolio that looked like it had accompanied her to academic conferences for decades. "You've certainly exceeded expectations," she said after we had ordered our coffee. "When I heard you were giving a plenary lecture, I must admit I was surprised. Surprised by my success, or surprised that someone you once dismissed could achieve recognition in mathematics." Chen's expression tightened slightly. "Dr. Rodriguez, if you're referring to our interactions during your undergraduate studies, I think you may be misremembering the nature of those conversations." I opened my own portfolio and removed a folder containing documents I had been carrying for 5 years, waiting for this moment. "Actually, Professor Chen, I have an excellent memory for those conversations. I also have documentation." I slid a copy of my undergraduate transcript across the table, with her comments from my academic file highlighted in yellow. Her handwritten evaluations were preserved there. "Lacks intuitive grasp necessary for advanced work. Struggles with abstract reasoning required for graduate study. May be better suited for applied rather than theoretical mathematics." Chen glanced at the papers without touching them. "Academic evaluations are based on observed performance at a specific point in time. They're not predictions of future potential." "These evaluations weren't based on my mathematical performance alone," I replied, removing another document from the folder. "This is the transcript from my academic hearing when I filed a formal complaint about gender bias in your classroom. The hearing had taken place during my senior year, after I had earned the highest score in Chen's class and been accepted to graduate programs at MIT, Harvard, and Stanford. I had decided that personal vindication wasn't enough. The systemic issues needed to be addressed. You told me, and I quote from the hearing transcript, that women simply lack the cognitive architecture for advanced mathematics. You suggested that my struggles were evidence of biological limitations rather than pedagogical problems." Chen was silent for a long moment, her coffee growing cold as she stared at the documents spread between us. "Dr. Rodriguez, the field of mathematics has evolved significantly in recent years. Our understanding of different learning styles, of the factors that contribute to mathematical success, has become more sophisticated. Has it, or have you simply been forced to confront evidence that contradicted your assumptions?" I pulled out the final document, a research paper I had published 2 years earlier in the Journal of Mathematical Education. The title read, "Institutional Bias and Mathematical Talent, a Longitudinal Study of Gender-Based Evaluation Practices." This paper analyzes 20 years of student evaluations from mathematics programs across 15 universities. The data shows systematic patterns of bias in how male and female students are assessed, with identical work receiving different evaluations based on the gender of the author. Chen finally picked up the paper and scanned the abstract. "This is interesting research, but it's somewhat outside my area of expertise." "Actually, Professor Chen, you're one of the case studies." Her eyes snapped up to meet mine. "Excuse me, page 14. I analyzed evaluation patterns from your classes over a 10-year period. Female students consistently received lower grades for work that was later evaluated by independent reviewers as equivalent to or superior to work by male students who received higher marks. The data had been damning. Chen's grading patterns showed statistically significant bias against female students, with evaluation comments that emphasized effort and persistence for women, while highlighting natural ability and insight for men with comparable performance. More troubling, I continued, were the advisory patterns. You recommended 63% of your male students for graduate study, compared to 22% of female students with equivalent academic records. Chen set down the paper and looked directly at me for the first time since our conversation began. "Dr. Rodriguez, what exactly do you want from this conversation?" "I want you to understand the impact of your actions." I want you to recognize that your assessment of my limitations wasn't based on mathematical ability, but on unconscious biases that have systematically excluded women from mathematical careers. And if I were to acknowledge such biases, what then? I leaned back in my chair, considering the question I had been asking myself for years. Then you could begin addressing them. You could examine your teaching methods, your evaluation practices, your assumptions about what mathematical talent looks like. You could become part of the solution instead of perpetuating the problem. Chen was quiet for several minutes, staring out the window at the bustling streets of Rio de Janeiro. You know, she said finally, when I was a graduate student, I was the only woman in my program. I faced considerable skepticism about my abilities, my commitment to the field, my potential for original research. I nodded, sensing that she was approaching something important. I succeeded by proving that I was better than the men around me, by demonstrating that I could meet and exceed every standard they set. I never questioned whether those standards were fair or appropriate. I simply worked harder to surpass them. And in the process, you internalized the very biases that had been used against you. Chen's smile was thin but genuine. Perhaps I convinced myself that if I could succeed despite the obstacles, then any woman who couldn't succeed simply wasn't working hard enough. The standards weren't the problem, Professor Chen. The assumption that struggling with those standards indicated fundamental inadequacy was the problem. The belief that there's only one way to demonstrate mathematical ability was the problem. Chen picked up the research paper again, this time reading more carefully through the methodology and findings. This is rigorous work, she admitted. The statistical analysis is sophisticated, the conclusions well supported. I learned rigorous thinking from excellent teachers, just not in your classroom. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of 8 years of accumulated anger and validation settling between us. Dr. Rodriguez, I owe you an apology, Chen said eventually. Not just for my assessment of your abilities, but for the broader impact of my teaching approach. If this research is accurate, and I have no reason to doubt that it is, then I have discouraged talented students from pursuing mathematics careers. The apology was important, but it wasn't enough. Professor Chen, I've spent 5 years documenting how institutional biases limit mathematical talent. But documentation without action is just academic exercise. The question is whether you're willing to make substantive changes to your teaching practices. Chen closed the research paper and looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, genuine curiosity rather than dismissive judgment. What would you recommend? Over the next hour, I outlined specific changes that could address the biases I had identified. Modified teaching methods that accommodated different learning styles. Evaluation practices that assessed understanding rather than performance speed. Advisory approaches that encouraged rather than discouraged students who didn't fit traditional templates. More importantly, I concluded, I'd recommend acknowledging that mathematical talent comes in many forms, and that creating inclusive environments actually enhances rather than compromises academic rigor. Chen took notes throughout our conversation, asking detailed questions about implementation strategies and assessment techniques. Dr. Rodriguez, would you be willing to present this research to our faculty? We're planning a retreat focused on improving undergraduate education, and your insights would be valuable. The invitation was unexpected but significant. Chen was essentially asking me to return to Columbia as an expert rather than a struggling student, to share research that directly challenged the teaching methods that had once nearly ended my mathematical career. I'd be honored to participate, I replied. 6 months later, I stood in the same building where Chen had once told me that women lacked the cognitive architecture for advanced mathematics. But this time, I was addressing a faculty retreat focused on creating more inclusive and effective teaching practices. The presentation was well received, generating the kind of engaged discussion that indicated real willingness to consider substantial changes. Chen participated actively, asking thoughtful questions and sharing insights from her own experiences implementing new approaches. After the session, she approached me with a familiar portfolio. Dr. Rodriguez, I wanted to give you something. She handed me a copy of my undergraduate file, but this version had been updated with new evaluations written in her careful handwriting. Elena Rodriguez demonstrated exceptional mathematical ability and persistence in overcoming pedagogical obstacles that should not have existed, read the new assessment. Her subsequent achievements validate concerns about institutional biases that can obscure rather than reveal mathematical talent. At the bottom of the page, Chen had added a personal note: "I was wrong about your abilities and wrong about the nature of mathematical talent more generally. Your success has taught me valuable lessons about the importance of inclusive teaching practices. Thank you for your patience and your commitment to improving our field." That evening, I walked across the Columbia campus where my mathematical journey had nearly ended 8 years earlier. The Gothic buildings looked the same, but everything else had changed. I was no longer a struggling undergraduate questioning her own abilities, but an established researcher whose work was reshaping how mathematical talent was understood and developed. I thought about the young women who would take Chen's classes in future semesters, who would benefit from teaching methods that recognized and nurtured different types of mathematical thinking. I thought about the research communities I had helped create, where diversity was valued as a source of innovation rather than tolerated as a concession to political correctness. The real victory wasn't my own success, though that had been personally satisfying. The real victory was systematic change that would ensure future generations of mathematicians would be evaluated based on their ideas rather than their demographics. As I reached the subway station, my phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus, now a professor at Berkeley. "Saw your TEDx talk online. 20 million views and counting." Chen's public letter about bias in mathematics education is trending on academic Twitter. "You've officially changed the conversation." I smiled, remembering the desperate young woman who had once sat in Chen's office being told that her dreams exceeded her biological capabilities. That woman had been wrong about many things, but she had been absolutely right about the most important one. Determination and proper understanding could overcome any supposed limitation. The subway train arrived, and as I settled into my seat for the ride home, I opened my laptop to work on my next research paper. The title read, "Beyond Individual Achievement: Creating Sustainable Change in Academic Mathematics." It was dedicated to every young person who had ever been told that their dreams were incompatible with their identity. Sometimes the greatest revenge is proving that the person who tried to limit you was not only wrong about you personally, but wrong about everything they thought they understood about human potential. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.